Honestly speaking, photography is simply a tool for me to express a lot of ideas. I'm actually a passionate nature lover and wildlife enthusiast. So for me, photography is just a medium of expression. It's just a tool that I use to express many things related to my actual passion, which is nature and wildlife.
Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw. The next image we have is okay. So it's called Polar Bear on Ice, and sure enough, you get around. So just to describe for okay, so essentially there's the curvature because of your lens. It's a very wide. It's probably a 14 millimeter lens or something. So it's a very wide angle shot. The horizon is really curved, right? So you get this feeling like it's almost like, oh, we're on the planet and the planet is curved. So even though it's essentially 3/4 of the image is dark ocean or sea with all these broken bits of ice, and you can just see the sun over the horizon, and the sky is quite overcast. And on these massive flows of ice, it's half. So half of it is water, and half of it is exposed chunks of ice. And there's this one lone polar bear. Kind of, it's a very stark image, but it's almost hopeful because it's mostly monochromatic because of the darkness of the sea and the whiteness of the ice, and then the paleness of the sky. But the sun and the polar bear have this sort of warmth to it. So why don't you talk to us about this image?
Sure. Apart from the fact that it has won me a lot of prizes, I would like to explain what went through when I did this image. So it was an Arctic expedition, Svalbard. This was the autumn in Svalbard, which is September. I mean, for an expedition like the Arctic, you cannot be like in Africa having an exclusive Jeep or a Land Cruiser. You have to share your ship with multiple people. And I remember I was with 35 photographers on this expedition because it's an expensive trip.
Wow.
The more the people, the lesser the cost. I do myself conduct expeditions where the cost is $10,500, where only 10, 12 people are there. But this one was a relatively less expensive photography expedition, which was organized by my Norwegian partners, and we were around 35 people on board. We do hear a knock on the door when somebody spots a polar bear at a distance from the bridge of the ship, and that's when we start putting on our warm clothing, our hoodies and gloves and shoes and all of that, and we rush to the upper deck of the ship so that we see the animal, and most often we see it at a distance. And likewise, we all carry a super telephoto lens, a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and we all went up and we saw this polar bear was at quite a distance, well, maybe about 400, 500 meters when I first saw him. And I don't know if it was a him or her. It's tough to recognize bears. It was a bear which was sitting on a chunk of ice. Now, as the ship started slowing down and slowly started getting closer and closer to the bear, we realized this bear was not afraid of the ship at all. So we make fun of these kind of bears, calling them photo bears.
Okay.
There are two kinds of polar bears that I have come across. One which sees a ship and simply runs away. I suspect that is because of the experience it has had with poaching or with hunters and stuff like that, because polar bears can be transcontinental. They can be hunted in Russia and they escape and come to Europe, and they go to Canada where they're hunted again, maybe.
Oh, wow.
So there are some bears which see the ship and just run away, while there are some who see the ship and they show a sense of curiosity and inquisitiveness, and they start coming closer. Maybe they smell the bacon in the kitchen, I don't know. So this one was a photo bear in our terminology. So it started walking towards the ship while the ship started slowly drifting towards the bear, and that's when we started clicking pictures. And like everybody else, I started using my telephoto, getting the whole bear in my frame. And then when it came very close, I realized I started using a 70 to 200 millimeter, and everybody were firing. All I could hear was 35 people into 5, 7, 8, 10 frames per second, and it was like a cacophony of shutter frames being heard. But I don't know how I realized that the only way to be making a picture which was different here was to, try and do something which the 34 of them were not doing. And I instantly picked up my 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and I started framing the shot in a wide angle. And I do have a lot of frames which are not a fisheye perspective,
Right.
where the horizon is rectilinear and it's a straight line. And I did capture a lot of habitat images, as we call it. In other words, environmental shots. So the thing which makes me in this photo an interesting photo for me is it narrates the plight of the polar bear in some ways, because the polar bear is losing the ice below its feet due to global warming, climate change, and stuff like that. On this very expedition, I did see a lot of polar bears which were stranded on islands which didn't have any ice around it, which meant they had to wait for the next season sea ice to form and the drift ice to come before they venture out on the sea long distances to find seals and walruses and whatnot. So there was this opportunity where it was not impossible to do a wide angle shot. So it was very natural for a creative photographer to envision wide angle. But then I realized, what if I use a different lens? Because many people are also creative. They were also doing wide angles, and there were also some landscape photographers using neutral density grad filters on a wide angle to shoot the sky better and stuff like that. That's when I realized the opportunity is the same. Lenses can be similar. The only way to make this different is to produce something different. So I remember running down 2 floors on the ship, from the upper deck to the lower deck to my cabin in the basement, opening my bag, because a fisheye lens is not something you carry around all the time.
Sure.
It was in my cabin in my bag, and wearing those huge apparels, like you're an astronaut. You can't walk like you walk on normal streets, so it's so much of clothing. So I ran down to my cabin, found the fisheye lens. I remember this was a Canon 815 fisheye,
Oh, wow.
Which is a full frame fisheye lens, which means at 8 millimeter you get an entire circle.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I was a Canon user. Now I'm a Sony ambassador. So I actually ran up with that 815 lens, and I unmounted my Canon 5D Mark III, which had a 2470 or a 7200. I can't remember precisely, and I mounted the 815 on it. And at 15 mm was a fisheye perspective. At 8 mm, it would be an entire circular fisheye lens. So at the 15 millimeter, I composed a few shots. By that time, I had lost maybe about 7-8 minutes. I don't know what the others would have got in those 7-8 minutes. I sacrificed a lot of images. But by this time, the polar bear had probably lost its interest. It didn't like the bacon. It didn't like the people. And it started walking away. And as I came up to the deck panting, I just saw the bear's back and it was walking away. And this is a shot which was probably after it started walking 15-20 feet from where we last saw it. And then it vanished into the horizon, and we didn't follow the bear any longer because it's not a good idea to disturb the bear.
No.
We waited for the bear to come close to us. We enjoyed a few minutes. When the bear lost interest and started walking away, we didn't want to pursue it any further. So this was the shot just before it left us.
It's you obviously know your gear. You know you're clearly experienced, and you understand your basically your tools. And sure enough, for a lot of images, and in a way, it's kind of one of the pillars of the podcast is what kind of story are you going to tell with your images, right? So everybody is going to be drawn to making certain images. For example, the very strong zoom to get in that tight telephoto shot, and then for whatever reason, your brain says, I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to get my fisheye very wide lens, and then this image, if anything, precisely because of climate change and the challenges that we're all like, you're a guy who, like, you're right now talking to me from Bangalore in India. I'm sitting in Hong Kong, and we're discussing a photograph of you in the Arctic, connected by the kind of the challenge of climate change, and it's astounding and it's profound. And so what was the most surprising consequence or effect or reaction that you got to this one particular image? Because you said you've won awards for it, but what was the surprising? I mean, winning an award, of course, is always nice, and it's a surprise. But what was the one standout, surprising reaction to this image that you thought was either encouraging or discouraging?
One is photographically, of course, there was a lot of attention to the image because it's a little unique. It's not a cliche portrait. But keeping aside the photography element, just looking at the actual intention of why I take pictures, it was a conversation starter because a lot of people could actually use a photograph to depict a discussion. Like, for example, we all speak about climate change and global warming, sea ice melting, and polar bears thriving and stuff like that. But how can you show a lot of these in one image? Which was probably the best thing that happened with respect to this image. People could talk about so many such things showing this image because it's the plight of a polar bear. It's the shrinking sea ice. It's the melting ice. It's the fragmented ice flows. It's like the polar bear is walking away from you, which is like a philosophical. It's a metaphor for you're losing the animal from your planet, kind of a feeling. So it was poetic for me, and also a lot of people could relate to it from that perspective. Apart from it just being a sharp photo with a beautiful sky or photographically speaking. Apart from that, it struck a chord with a common man. I do remember it had all kinds of discussions. I did have a lot of people who also were completely contradicting my interest, and they were asking me, hey, we have a lot of issues in India itself. Why do you need to go to the Arctic to take pictures of polar bears to discuss conservation and all of that? So this is an image I used to tell people in India that exactly like what you said, you're sitting in Hong Kong, I'm in India, but why are we talking about the Arctic? Because everything that we do in India affects the Arctic, and what happens to the Arctic affects India.
Yeah.
So that interrelation between poles and polar regions and virtually even the rainforest and everywhere in the globe to where we are is something which is not very easy for a common man to understand.
Sure.
They think India is a political boundary, so you need to work on tigers if you're an Indian wildlife photographer. And I did get comments that we have the Sundarbans, which is a mangrove, and we have tigers suffering there because of tidal, for example, cyclones and all of that. So I use this image to say that if you protect the Arctic, if you make sure the global warming slows down, the sea ice melting slows down, that's when the mangroves will not die because the water levels won't rise.
Sure.
And that is how you can ensure that you protect a tiger. So if you don't learn the problems of the Arctic, you're not going to save the tiger in India. And that's the kind of conversation I can have with an image like this, which is probably the most precious thing for me.
That's great. Fantastic. Through the podcast, my mission is also to kind of share great photographs to other audiences, to other people, and hopefully through a conversation that inspires them to find out either more about you or about your work, and also just to connect with this image, because it is really powerful. It is just really great.
So is life really a gift? Really? Can you make every second count? That's the whole point of the podcast. So if you like what you've seen and you're inspired, because that really is my mission, then please give it a like, subscribe, and share.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.